Okay, I want to talk you through my understanding of and annotation of A New Heaven by Wilfred Owen, just to model my own thinking, really. Obviously, poems are open to interpretation, so you might have come up with some different ideas. That doesn't mean that it's wrong, it's just that this is the way that I've chosen to interpret the text. The first thing I would look at here is the notations at the bottom, which give you some clues as to when and where the poem was written, and perhaps what Wilfred Owen was thinking of and alluding to throughout the text. And you can see here that it says it was written probably at Whitley in September 1916. So I know from this that it was pre-Sassoon, before he met Siegfried Sassoon at Craig Lockhart, which happened in 1917, and that it's probably going to have quite a lot of romantic influences, which I've written about here, because before he met Sassoon, that was typically his style. So I'm expecting it to be a little bit like that. And then we can see that the title was taken from Revelation, which is a book in the Bible, and it talks about a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. So it's kind of making me think, well, as it's a war poem, perhaps heaven here is home, and perhaps the new heaven is talking about him growing up, becoming a little bit more realistic, because having read the poem through a couple of times already, it seems like there's a shift from childhood innocence to kind of more adult, grown-up, more factual kind of relation or attitude towards death. Also, it makes me think that perhaps nothing will be the same again after the war, and that the whole world has been destroyed, and so therefore there is a new heaven, a new earth, and that the first earth has passed away. So there's no returning back to the world as it was before World War One. Okay, so now we look up here at the title. From reading around this, we can see that it's to someone on active service. It could have been Lieutenant Briggs, who he described as being quite my closest chum on the 14th of April 1916. A New Heaven, the poem seems to be about returning home, so does that mean that heaven is England and that that's what they're fighting for, so that's what makes it all worthwhile? Is heaven being worshipped? Because again in the poem it seems like it's moving from a sense of regret in the first stanza that they didn't find fairyland, that they never reached these kind of mythical heavens that are referred to throughout the poem, and therefore because they couldn't get there, that they should return home across the channel, where they will be remembered and revered by boys and girls in generations to come, and by their own mother, by their own parents as well. So perhaps heaven is that sense of being worshipped. If you link that to an identity disc poem, then you can see that was quite important to Wilfred Owen, the idea of people remembering him and having his name up high. And as this is quite an early poem, before he actually went across the channel to fight, perhaps that is what he is really talking about here, this idea that it's worth fighting for because you'll always be remembered. So then we can start to look through the poem itself. Active service, of course, links to ideas of sacrificing yourself for your country, which kind of links to what I've just said. So, seeing as we never found gay fairyland, though still we crouched by bluebells moon by moon. We is a plural, which suggests that he's talking about himself and a friend. We never found it, which kind of gives me this idea of a sense of failure. Perhaps a sense of failure in his life, or a sense of failure in death, because he never found fairyland after that. But it could be both of those things. We've also got images there in those first two lines of childhood. So perhaps, fairyland and bluebell woods were a childhood heavenly thing. So it suggests innocence here at the beginning of the poem. Still we crouched suggests that they're waiting for something. Excuse me. So, and perhaps this was waiting for the battle to begin. So perhaps moon by moon was when they crouched, waiting for the battle to begin when they were soldiers, or it could have been crouching in woods during moonlight in childhood games, although that seems more unlikely because children would probably have to go to bed before it got dark. Throughout this first stanza, there are lots of classical allusions. Lethe, Styx, Mecca, Asgard and Nirvana are all mentioned. But this doesn't really seem to fit with a child's experience. They're quite adult words, they're quite grown-up words, and to understand the repetition of them and the references behind them, the allusions made, you would need to have some background knowledge as an adult, so it kind of doesn't seem to fit in some ways. The repetition of nor at the beginning of lines 5, 6 and 7 again suggests some kind of loss or failure on the poet's part or on the narrator's part. They can't get to any of these places, they can't reach them. And in the last line as well, from high paradise are cursed and banned. They cannot get to heaven for some reason. And that makes me wonder why not. Perhaps because they're not worthy, perhaps because they are fighting and killing people in the war, perhaps because the innocence of the world has been lost and therefore their own childhood innocence has been lost and they're full of sins, either that they're going to commit or that they have committed. In the sestet, the last 6 lines, there's a different tone really here. It's a lot more down to earth. When they say, let's die home, ferry across the channel, perhaps here it's suggesting that heaven is at home. That's where you find your heaven, because that's where the people who love you are. Thus shall we live God's there. In memorials, perhaps that's where they'll be immortalised and where their name will live on forever. We talked again about how in an identity disc, the idea of having his name up in Poets' Corner at Westminster was quite important to him. So perhaps that's what will make him godlike and immortal, the fact that his name will be written in stone. Death shall be no severance. They'll always be remembered. They'll always be part of those people in their hearts and in their minds and in the memory. So although their spirit will be gone and their body will be gone, actually they will always still be remembered there, so it won't be that they're being taken apart from someone else. Weary cathedrals, light new shines for us. Although the cathedrals are weary and tired, perhaps because they're so old or perhaps because there's so much death already within them, the idea of light is usually associated with something more positive. So it's the idea, I think, that they gain something here. New shrines for us, again, is quite a positive image, and it links very closely to Anthem for Doomed Youth, which we studied just recently in class as well, along with the next 2 lines as well. So, weary cathedrals, light new shrines for us. To us, rough knees of boys shall ache with reverence. So boys will kneel before their name up in this stone. Are not girls' breasts a clear, strong acropole? Perhaps it's not a sexual reference to breasts at all, but the idea that within your breast is your heart. So maybe they're protected by the chests of these girls because they're living in their hearts. So it gives them again this sense of life after death. And then finally in the last line, there our own mother's tears shall heal us whole. So the curse that's mentioned at the end of the first stanza is gone here. It's been taken away by the mother's tears who protect them. I think also with the references to girls and mothers, to be loved and to be remembered is heavenly in a way, isn't it? So perhaps that's where this new heaven is coming from the memory of what they've done. Is he saying here that war is worth dying for? That anything is worth dying for your country? Which again doesn't seem to fit with his later poems, which are quite critical of the war. But this is written quite early on, and perhaps he's actually suggesting here that it's a glorious thing to die for your country, which later on he goes on to really argue against.